probably my camera.
Yeah.
You know, I love to document, but it's mostly me taking pictures of my dog and sending them to you.
For many commentators, the conversation around Rachel Zegler's casting as Snow White didn't simply begin with criticism of her performance. It began with a broader sense that she approached the role with an attitude that felt unusually self-focused and disconnected from the material. They argued that she carried herself with a kind of self-assurance that bordered on dismissive, combined with an extremely modern, hyper-progressive perspective that clashed sharply with a character born from a 1937 fairy tale. That contrast became the center of an ongoing debate. How can someone play one of the most iconic roles in classic animation while simultaneously expressing open disdain for the original film that defined it? The criticism intensified as many people claimed the casting wasn't just questionable, it was perhaps one of the most mismatched choices Hollywood had made in recent memory. Their argument wasn't limited to appearance. It was about tone, personality, and respect for the legacy of a character cherished for generations. Hollywood has made controversial casting decisions in the past, but for this group of critics, the Snow White remake became the pinnacle example of what they saw as modern studios misunderstanding their own audience. Zegler's interviews, in their eyes, only strengthened that perception. They noted that instead of embracing the opportunity and the history attached to the role, she repeatedly distanced herself from it, emphasizing how outdated she believed the story to be and how uninterested she was in its themes of romance and innocence. This narrative clashed with what many expect of a lead actress in a remake of a beloved property. Critics argued that an actor's job is to bring the script to life, honor the material, collaborate with directors and writers, and respect the world they step into, not reinvent it according to personal beliefs. Some felt she treated the role not as a legacy to uphold, but as a platform to reshape the character into something entirely different, something that didn't resemble the original Snow White at all. Whether or not one agrees with her perspective, the resulting friction was undeniable. But the debate didn't stop with her. Attention quickly shifted to Gal Gadot, who was cast as the evil queen. In the fairy tale, the queen's entire motivation rests on her envy of Snow White's beauty. Critics felt that dynamic simply didn't work here, because audiences struggled to believe Gadot, a former model, recognized globally for her beauty, would be threatened by Snow White's appearance, as portrayed in this adaptation. Even in a world filled with talking mirrors, enchanted forests, and magical curses, the visual contrast made suspension of disbelief harder than usual. For those who value authenticity within fantasy, it became another pillar in the argument that the film's casting choices felt oddly mismatched. Then came the leaks. Disney never intended the public to see early images from production. They certainly didn't expect behind-the-scenes photos, unpolished scenes, or incomplete CGI stand-ins to circulate across social media months before the marketing campaign was ready. What was intended to be a polished, carefully timed promotional rollout was instead derailed by viral leaks that exposed the film in its roughest state. Suddenly, speculation exploded. Discussions shifted from mild curiosity to widespread concern. Even people who were indifferent to the project couldn't avoid the trending images, commentary, and reactions that flooded every platform. Meanwhile, Zegler's interviews became another unexpected source of controversy. She spoke openly and confidently about how this new Snow White would reject romance, dismiss traditional fairy tale tropes, and focus instead on becoming a powerful leader. These statements weren't whispered backstage or leaked from private conversations. They were delivered during press tours, often with a playful defiance that some interpreted as confidence and others saw as condescension toward the story's origins. Her remarks about being paid for every hour the film streamed, combined with her insistence that the original movie was outdated or even creepy, struck many longtime fans as disrespectful to the legacy of the character and to the creators whose work made the remake possible in the first place. At the same time, Gadot was dealing with her own set of controversies unrelated to the role itself. Her public image, shaped by past political statements, became another flashpoint that merged into the growing pile of issues surrounding the production. It wasn't necessarily her performance being questioned. It was the environment surrounding her, adding yet another layer of tension to an already chaotic situation. As the backlash grew, observers pointed out that both actresses faced criticism, though for different reasons, creating the perception that the movie was becoming a magnet for negative press. By this point, the situation seemed to take on a life of its own. What should have been a celebratory modern retelling of a timeless story was now overshadowed by public skepticism, viral debates, and a marketing nightmare no one at Disney appeared prepared to handle. Fans who cherished the 1937 classic felt the remake was abandoning the heart of the original. Meanwhile, audiences who simply wanted a fresh, respectful instead of excitement, the narrative became dominated by tension, defensiveness, and a sense that the film no longer represented the nostalgia people associated with Snow White. The casting announcement had once been intended to spark curiosity and anticipation, but instead, many say it marked the beginning of a shift, almost like a spell lifting, revealing a very different version of the story than anyone expected. When Rachel Zegler repeated in interviews that Snow White would not dream of true love, would not be saved by a prince, and would instead forge her own destiny as a leader, critics argued that this reinterpretation strayed too far from what gave the original its emotional core. For them, Snow White wasn't meant to be reimagined into a completely different person, but updated with care, not replaced with a character unrecognizable from her roots. And so the public discourse transformed the film long before it ever reached theaters. Instead of discussions about visuals, music, or storytelling, the conversation became dominated by questions of respect, legacy, and whether the studio truly understood why the original Snow White had endured for nearly a century. The situation became so dramatic that some joked you could practically hear Walt Disney turning in his cryogenic chamber, bewildered by how far his classic had been reinterpreted. What happened with this movie wasn't just a misfire. It was the opening sequence of a full-scale disaster movie wearing a fairy tale costume. Everything started sliding downhill the moment the first interviews dropped. Instead of embracing the legacy of Snow White or calming the nerves of skeptical fans, Rachel Zegler seemed determined to lecture them. In a now infamous viral clip, she casually made fun of the original storyline, described the prince as weird, and rolled her eyes at the idea of a romance. It was the kind of commentary that might have worked for a late-night comedy bit, but not when you're the face of one of Disney's most delicate, nostalgia-heavy remakes. Meanwhile, Disney had its own panic brewing. They finally committed to releasing their new Snow White adaptation, but then quietly scaled back the Hollywood premiere. When asked why, analysts pointed to one reason. Rachel Zegler had become a PR crisis Disney could no longer control. Yes, audiences in 2024 want stronger female characters, but there's a vast difference between modernizing a story and setting its entire identity on fire. What made the situation even more volatile was her tone. It wasn't just confidence, it landed as condescending. Instead of updating Snow White, she seemed to be reinventing the character from the ground up, almost as if the legacy owed her something. And then came the comment that instantly entered Hollywood's Hall of PR disasters. Their dynamic turned into a social media detective game. Every interview, every staged photo op, every red carpet moment, they stood stiffly, side by side, like two coworkers, forced into a team-building exercise neither of them signed up for. At some events, Gal looked seconds away from muttering, "I need a glass of wine," under her breath. Fans noticed immediately. The tension was so thick that when the Oscars introduced them together on stage, the energy was icy enough to freeze the enchanted forest. The two actresses stood apart with tight smiles, polite nods, and body language that said, "HR told us to behave." It was the kind of awkwardness you can feel through the screen. But the real blow came from the film itself. This wasn't just a remake, it was a complete reimagining. And reimagining, in Hollywood terms, is often code for prepare for chaos.
What's really interesting is that Zegler's fall from grace has been a very satisfying watch for plenty of people.
Their dynamic turned into a social media detective game. Every interview, every staged photo op, every red carpet moment. They stood stiffly, side by side, like two coworkers, forced into a team-building exercise neither of them signed up for. At some events, Gal looked seconds away from muttering, "I need a glass of wine," under her breath. Fans noticed immediately. The tension was so thick that when the Oscars introduced them together on stage, the energy was icy enough to freeze the enchanted forest. The two actresses stood apart with tight smiles, polite nods, and body language that said, "HR told us to behave." It was the kind of awkwardness you can feel through the screen. But the real blow came from the film itself. This wasn't just a remake, it was a complete reimagining. And reimagining, in Hollywood terms, is often code for prepare for chaos. The original story was stripped down and rearranged until it barely resembled the classic. Snow White no longer received her name from the fairness of her skin. Instead, she got the name because she apparently survived a snowstorm. The dwarfs vanished. The prince disappeared. The whimsy was gone. The romance was gone. And somehow, even the joy was gone. Instead of a magical adventure, audiences got explanations, moral lectures, and heavy-handed metaphors about fairness and inner beauty. Rachel emphasized in interviews that the real message of Snow White had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with one's heart. And while the sentiment wasn't controversial on its own, the way the film delivered it left many viewers feeling like they were sitting through a seminar, not a fairy tale. Hardcore Disney fans felt alienated. Parents didn't know how to explain the new storyline to their kids. And the kids were simply bored. No one goes to a Disney film expecting to walk out feeling like they just completed a mandatory training session. What audiences wanted was wonder, magic, humor, charm, and romance. What they got instead was a lecture disguised as a princess movie, one that forgot the very ingredients that made Disney, Disney. And while everything around the film was already crumbling, Rachel Zegler kept talking. Every press junket became less of a promotional event and more of a masterclass in how to lose a fandom in 10 minutes or less. Her interviews drifted away from excitement about the movie and instead centered on defending herself, correcting critics, and presenting herself as the misunderstood revolutionary behind a cinematic reinvention no one had asked for. She wasn't just responding to trolls, she was alienating entire sections of Disney's most loyal fan base. But rather than recalibrate her tone, she doubled down, then tripled down. And then, in the grand finale of Damage Control, she filmed a moody Instagram story in a hoodie, reflecting tearfully about being proud of her work, even if the world wasn't ready to appreciate it. What was meant to be a standard press tour, designed to build anticipation, turned into a slow-motion brand implosion. Rachel Zegler didn't simply star in Snow White. She became the cautionary tale future PR teams will study in corporate postmortems. This wasn't one bad interview or a single misquote blown out of proportion. It was a consistent pattern, a snowball rolling downhill from the moment she criticized the original film, gathering momentum all the way to the box office premiere. And spoiler, opening weekend did not bring a happily ever after. By the time the film finally hit theaters, the damage was already well beyond repair. Disney's reputation was bruised, fans were furious, and Rachel Zegler was now more famous for the controversy surrounding her than for her actual performance. And the worst part? That was only Act 1. Because the real horror story wasn't what happened on screen. It was everything happening off of it. When Snow White debuted, it didn't stumble. It detonated. A $45 million opening and a painful 1.6 IMDb rating painted a picture no studio executive wants to see on a Monday morning. The movie didn't open to disappointment. It opened to expectation. Everyone saw it coming. The failure wasn't a twist. It was the inevitable ending, written the moment casting was announced. Fans didn't quietly skip the film. They practically threw a celebration for its downfall. Memes flooded social media. Reaction channels uploaded entire live streams, mocking the film before some theaters even finished their final Thursday previews. Disney had unintentionally created the world's first anti-fairy tale fairy tale. Not a bold reinvention, not a misunderstood masterpiece, a public rejection unfolding in real time. And then, in the middle of the chaos, came the strangest plot twist. An AI-generated Rachel Zegler profile suddenly appeared on OnlyFans, racking up thousands of followers within hours. It wasn't real, wasn't connected to her team, and wasn't verified. But for a moment, the internet genuinely hesitated. Was this a pivot? Was it a hack? Was it a joke? That confusion said everything. Public perception had reached such a bizarre place, somewhere between infamy and fascination, that people truly wondered whether this was her next career move. Defenders called it a cruel hoax. Critics treated it like a digital punchline. But either way, the moment became a symbolic snapshot of just how far the PR narrative had spiraled. Behind the scenes, Disney was in panic mode. This wasn't just another disappointing live-action remake. It was a full-blown theatrical crisis. Ticket sales weren't declining, they were collapsing. Social media wasn't discussing the film, they were ridiculing it. And theaters responded in the most brutal but predictable way by quietly phasing it out. Primetime evening showings were replaced with safer titles. Family matinees disappeared from weekend schedules. In some theaters, Snow White was buried so deep in the Showtime listings, you'd need a lantern and a treasure map to find it. It was the cinematic equivalent of being asked to leave your own birthday party. But as the movie was fading from theater screens, a different chapter of Rachel's career began resurfacing, the forgotten Wicked scandal. Long before she stepped into the Disney spotlight, she had been circling the Wicked adaptation, not just casually, but with ambition. And not for a supporting role, she had her eyes on Elphaba, the role. Reportedly, she hinted publicly, shared vocal clips from Wicked songs, and even tried to push herself into early casting conversations. It was a piece of Hollywood gossip many had forgotten. Until now, when fans began drawing lines between her past behavior and the present catastrophe. Producers weren't clueless. They saw the storm forming long before anyone else did. The traits that would later explode on the Snow White set were already quietly revealing themselves in those early auditions and meetings. The impulsive comments, the tendency to dominate conversations, the subtle clashes with people who were simply trying to do their jobs. It was all there, simmering beneath the surface. And unlike Disney, those producers didn't ignore the red flags. They didn't wait for the PR disasters, the viral sound bites, or the awkward press moments. They simply and very quietly showed her the door before the situation grew into something they'd have to publicly explain. Now Rachel's career isn't just paused, it feels suspended, frozen in the air, like a fairy tale spell gone wrong. Not too long ago, she was celebrated as the bright young star who emerged from West Side Story with a world of possibilities ahead of her. But today, her name is whispered more as a cautionary tale than a rising talent. It isn't just that a movie underperformed or that a few interviews went sideways. It's the accumulation of everything. The missteps, the misreads, the moments that went viral for reasons no actor ever wants, and the unmistakable discomfort on the faces of the people standing next to her, especially Gal Gadot, who often looked like she wished she could fade into the background whenever they shared a stage. It became the perfect storm. Bad timing, bad optics, an unchecked confidence that didn't match the public's sentiment. and a complete misunderstanding of what audiences were willing to embrace. What makes the situation even more surreal is that Rachel herself doesn't appear to notice the shift. She's still posting, still making statements, still talking about empowerment and being heard, as if the world hasn't moved on. But the real question isn't whether she's speaking, it's whether anyone is still listening. Studios aren't calling. Co-stars aren't stepping forward to defend her. Fans aren't lining up to support her projects. And in Hollywood, silence is never empty. It's expressive. It speaks louder than any tweet, louder than any apology video, louder than any press tour clip. The industry isn't vindictive, it's strategic. And right now, the calculation is simple. The risk of building another major franchise around Rachel Zegler outweighs the reward. Her fall from grace wasn't sudden. It didn't happen in one dramatic collapse. It unfolded slowly, almost artistically, frame by frame, interview by interview, soundbite by soundbite, until one of the most anticipated fairy tale reboots of the decade transformed into something closer to a career autopsy. The irony is almost poetic. A story that ends not with a prince, not with a magical awakening, but with a warning. A reminder that in Hollywood, being the fairest of them all isn't about looks or talent. It's about self-awareness. It's about knowing when to speak, when to step back, and when to stop trying to reshape a narrative the audience has already rejected. In the end, the story Rachel tried so hard to control became the very one that wrote her downfall.